Thank you. Next up, we have the inimitable RTDP. He's another programmer I'm jealous of. He just swans about the world programming Ruby and enjoying life. Also, he's a very funny guy. If you had the pleasure of watching one of his talks before, you'll know what I'm saying. He brings with him that classic understated Puneri humor that Puneris love so much, at least, at any rate. Anyone here don't know him already? I guess, yeah, sure. So Ratnadeep, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where do you work? What do you do? How are you so cool?
So I'm Ratnadeep. I am RTDP on Twitter. I like programming Ruby. I also like traveling. So I used to combine the traveling and programming, but my friends have said that I shouldn't talk about the travel this time. So that's about me.
That's great. So he's going to tell you the story of Rails. Does it have a happy ending?
Somewhat. Okay. Hello, everyone. So this is my talk about the story of Rails. So I will directly go into the important part, but why? Why should I know about the story of Rails, right? So one of the reason is that Rails has evolved a lot in the past few years, and it has become a so big a framework that whenever someone who is a newcomer to the Rails tries to understand what the Rails is about, try to know all its features, then it becomes pretty insane pretty soon that there are so many things inside the Rails. So I'm just trying to dissect a couple of parts of it and try to reason why certain feature came into the Rails and why it has its place into the framework, right? And I think going into such whys can simplify the Rails, can simplify learning the Rails, knowing the whys, okay? When I started creating this presentation, I went to the Ruby on Rails doctrine that is there on the Rails website. And one of the things that, that was there was for Ruby is for the developer happiness and Rails to make them smile. I forgot the S there. But yeah, to make them smile. And to illustrate that fact, here is one of the code examples that was present on that site, which is like when you open an IRB, you can type in the quit and you get out of that. Or you can type the exit and then you again get out of that. You don't have to, do anything else apart from that. But if you are on Python and if you type the exit, the Python will tell you the way in which you should tell it to exit out of. It knows that you want to exit, but it wouldn't let you exit out of it. You have to specify in these terms. You have to follow their rules. And that is the difference between the Python and the Ruby, okay? I think if you have not used older Rails versions, probably before the Rails 3, you might not know that this was a real valid method in the Rails. You could actually do a find by and then combine all your database columns to get the find by first name, last name, and email, and then provide all those attributes, and it will actually do the finding. So in the initial days, I remember that this was one of the prominent, I would say, features that was used to market the Rails. Isn't that interesting? Obviously, it has a performance implications, and so it's been deprecated now. Then there is this array.42. So it has also an interesting story. So whenever I'm on the console and I'm trying to debug the Rails applications, say I have a couple of records taken out into an array and I'm trying to debug which records is which and whatnot, right? So generally you do array.first, array.second, array.third. There was a time when I wanted to use array.eighth or something, and then it was not an valid method. So I went on to search what are the ways or what are the methods that are there in the Ruby, which I can call on the array while I'm on the debugging mode, okay? I found a Rails commit by DHH, which had added all these methods like ruby.first, second, third, fourth, and fifth, okay, just for debug purposes. And then I tried to search more of that, and I went on and I found a Reddit thread. So that Reddit thread was ridiculating this feature of Rails that you are calling all these first, second methods on array while you already have the notation of calling an array on that and passing the element number, and you could also always get that, right? And then it went a little viral. It got attention of DHH. What he did to troll them, he added array.42 method. If you know, or if you have read the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you know what I mean. The 42 number has a pretty big meaning to it. So that Rails doctrine also has these lines that Ruby has been designed with principle of least surprise. But he mentions that least surprise to whom? So he says that it's least surprise to Mats, and Rails has been designed with the principle of bigger smile for DHH. So he goes on and tells how things are, or API endpoints or the APIs that are there in the Rails are designed in such a way that they can bring in the maximum smile to him. Okay? So that's when I think I came with this line. Like, if Ruby is the language, then Rails is the joke that is told in that language. If Ruby makes you smile, if Ruby makes you happy, then Rails should make you smile. So we'll start with what was there in the Rails earlier versions. We can say that in the Rails 1, it was just all the plugins. These plugins, not gems, but the plugins had no versioning, no dependency management. In the Rails 2, that was somewhat fixed by adding the gem support and the plugins. Everything of these things become the first-class citizens. But around the same time, it also added the dependency on the rack. And what used to happen was if you have Rails 2 and you want to include any of the other gem that also dependent on the rack, then it used to collide. Ruby has a require which is in the global namespace, right? So you cannot have two gems with the different versions, and it used to be a pretty big of clutter. At the same time, to create these gems and maintain and publish these gems, there was a tool called as a gem cutter. I think some of you might remember that there was a tool like that. Later on, it got shifted to other things, and then it got renamed to something like Ruby Gems. So the today's Ruby Gems has its origin from the gem cutter. So back in those days, this is how you used to specify the versions inside the Rails application. So you have config.environment.rb. That file is still there, but back then it has additional responsibilities. Like at the top, you can see that there is a Rails gem version, which was 2.3.11. And at the bottom, you have other configurations and specifications mentioned, like you have, we can see that Will Paginate is there, one of the popular gems back then, which got replaced by Kaminari and things like that. And you also could specify if you want gems to be taken from the GitHub or any other sources. But once you have these things, there was one option to do them or install them with the rake gems install. There wasn't any bundler. And then there used to be a lot of other dependencies and stuff, which you have to go on the command line and see which gems are listed, install one by one, make sure that their versions are not colliding. Then add in those times, the versioning was not using the right conventions to make sure that the breaking changes are specified in the correct versions and stuff. And to complicate the matters further, there was no bundler and there was nothing like RVM or RBENV. So you have to pull down the Ruby that you want and compile it on your machine. If you have two different versions of applications using the different versions of Ruby, then best of luck. It used to be pretty bad. And then came the bundler. So this solved pretty much many problems that were there in those days. It added the per application based dependency resolution. It added gemfile.doc. You could specify all the gems and their versions, and then all the things that you know today. But remember that there were days when this was not a thing that you could have. Just on that note, I remember I used to have a problems with the bundler, saying that bundler used to show all the newly installed gems that are there, but it never showed which version it upgraded them from. So whenever you have a bundler running or bundler install, there used to be some gems that are upgraded for their major versions, and upgrading to a major versions used to break the application. For example, if you have a bootstrap Rails and you were using 2.0 of that, and then you started using 3.0, the internal bootstrap libraries were also used to upgrade, and then your UI used to become mess. So I remember suggesting this issue, and then it got into latter versions wherein you can see that here, like active admin was 143 and then 131, and then it got upgraded to 143. So things like these and niceties like these, it kept on evolving with things like that. Then the Rails and the MERB. So MERB, as I remember Matt mentioned in a little while ago, was a framework in 2009, and the MERB and the Rails has a pretty big competition going on between them. So MERB was obviously also a Rails Ruby-based framework for creating the web application. So what they did is they took some of the ideas and improved on them very big way. For example, they took the controller stack, and once you have that, many of the things can be configured. For example, once you have the controller stack on the back end, you can have a rack and mongrel for the web server or some alternatives. Then for the front end, you could have ERB, or then the HAML came a little afterwards. And on the model side, you had the data mapper. So instead of having the active record, they had the data mapper. So one of the things, and a very important one at that, is that because the MERB was merged into the Rails with a Rails version of 3.0, many of the things and improvements came to the Rails. For example, modularity. Because of that, all the things that are there in the Rails these days could be taken out if you don't want them, or you could just take something out of Rails that you want in your own project, something that wasn't common back in the days. Then it also defined the public APIs correctly, in the sense that gem owners and the plugin owners can use those public APIs which are well documented and then build their gems on that front. Earlier, like in the Rails 2.0 versions, the public APIs were not defined, and it was pretty hard to keep up with the Rails upgrades as and when the APIs were changing. And then performance and scalability. So MERB became popular, and one of the reasons that it became popular was because of the performance that it offered compared to the Rails. And all that came with the merger to the Rails as well. So I remember like Yehuda Katz was one of the prominent developer who worked heavily on the bundler development as well as Rails 3 and MERB merger work. And the important part was about the upgrade lessons as well. So upgrading your old 2.0 Rails application to the 3.0 was pretty heavy work, and upgrading from the 3.0 to 3.1 was also pretty hard because of addition of the asset pipelines and stuff. But the important part was after that, when 3.0 applications upgraded to 4 or 4 to 5, they always had some kind of a task or rake tasks that were added in to make the upgradation process pretty easy. So these were the lessons that happened with the Rails 3 upgrade that were used to add or make sure that the upgradation processes in future remain pretty effective. So this is on the one of the days of 4th March 2012, where a developer called as Homakov, a Russian guy, he got in touch with the GitHub to let them know that there was a security flaw with the way Rails handled the mass assignments. But somehow they didn't care or they didn't bother, and they said that it's the common practice, or they pointed the finger towards the Rails. So no one heard him correctly or did something or acted on something that he was suggesting. So he had to make a point. What he did, he just hacked GitHub and Rails and made a commit on the master branch of the Rails hosted on the GitHub. Not just that, he also hacked the DHH's account and added some of the commit messages or comments on the GitHub thread that was going on there. And that was a pretty big, the Hacker News and all other sites, and everyone was covering that, and it was pretty big fiasco. So what actually happened back then was, this is something that you can see these days as well, that whenever you want to save a new user, what you do is user.new, you pass in all the parameters to that object, and then you run the user.save, right? But what happens if those parameters are coming from a client side, and I just change or add the foreign keys as well into those parameters? In the earlier versions of the Rails, that was never checked So with this user.new, I can create that user and make him, say for example, if this user has a role field, I can set that value to anything that I want. I could pass any parameters that I want, and the Rails will happily save that. This was a huge, huge issue. So in the next versions, we got the strong parameters, and now we have it always in our controllers. And I have seen that newcomers and freshers sometimes find that pretty annoying. Why do I need to permit some of the parameters to save in my models? Well, this is the reason you have to permit your parameters, so that only the whitelisted parameters can be passed through these strong parameters and actually go into the database. Then there was an asset management evolving that happened with the Rails. So in the very early days, there was a library called as a prototype that was there in the Rails. And it allowed some features like in your Rails forms, you could specify remote true. And with just that, you could submit a form, and it used to be submitted via the Ajax. And that was pretty convenient. I remember one of the videos that was shared on the initial Rails website. The video was pretty. I mean, okay, but it didn't had even a voice over. It was just DHH doing some work, and one of the things back then was you couldn't find any other framework with such kind of a marketing material, including a video on a website. So that was pretty good of DHH to do the marketing side right for the Rails as well. Then there was asset pipeline that came with the Rails 3.1 and the sprockets and all other versions. This is one other thing that I find mostly confusing for the people. Like you're trying to save a form, and then invalid authenticity token error is raised. And then many a times this also happens with the front-end developers, that they are trying to submit something with Ajax calls, and then they came across errors like these, and they are clueless why it's happening. So the reason for that is that security. So whenever someone wants to use something apart from the Rails, like some framework that is built in Node.js, or even in the Rails like Sinatra and other things, they forget that Rails is not just the MVP architecture and some folders that come that tell you how to use that architecture. It's much, much more than that. Okay, so it provides the XSS, which is cross-site security, and then CORS, and then UTF-8 encoding, SQL injection. So these are some of the features that come bundled with the Rails, and if you have to take care of these things in your own custom framework or a framework that doesn't provide these out of the box, then it pretty much is a problem. And then you have to be aware, or make everyone on the team aware, that these things exist, and you have to make sure that you don't fall in any of these loopholes. Along the way, I remember there were some of the interesting things as well. For example, I had raised this issue back in like 2011, which was whenever you are formatting the numbers on the websites, we have a helper called as number to currency, but it always converted numbers into the formatting that was specific to the US, like a million billion style of writing, but it never did it right for the lakhs and crores that we use. And then I had posted this question, and the replies were like, what does that mean? I mean, it's very confusing to read a number in a lakh crore format. Why do you need that? And then what is RS, which is a rupees symbol, right? Sooner or later, that got fixed with one of the message from the, or one of the commits from the, or pull request from the Vipul, and it got in. So yeah, just one of the interesting notes. I deliberately did not keep the titles for these graphs, just so that you can guess. I'm sure nobody can guess it, but let's, like, why not? So these are the graphs that I have taken from Google's interest over time, wherein you can see what are the search trends and whatnot. So these are the two trends that you can see. As you can see, everything is like fluctuating quite a lot. So the top trend is Rails, can Rails scale? So every once in a while, every few years, every few months, there are the blog posts, and there are things which ask the question whether the Rails is dead and whether Rails can scale. So these are the graphs. Top one is about whether Rails is dead, whether Rails is scale, Rails can scale, and the bottom one is about whether Rails is dead. In the Rails is dead section, I think there was one spike in around like 2014, 15 or some time around that. But next time you see or come across these kind of articles, try searching some articles in the web archive. It's been there since pretty long. And that also reminds me having a conversation with one of the, I guess, Java guys back in the days, maybe 15, 16. And so we were debating whether the Ruby as a language or any other languages like Python, PHP, and Java is better. So I was telling why this is good, and he was coming up with some other things like this is good and that is good, and then we were not coming to any conclusion. So finally, I just told him one thing that made him a Ruby guy, or more of he understood why Ruby is good. And the one thing that I told him is how much Ruby developers earn. Yeah. So to conclude my talk, so when I was telling about my talk to some of the guys, they said it will be pretty nostalgic to see all the things and whatnot. So speaking to everyone, I decided, I mean, uh, Mads is feeling happy writing the Ruby, while DHH is having smiles while developing the Rails. So, why should I write the conclusions for my talk? I have other things like this nostalgia. So this is one of the Rails website back in 2009, if you remember. And then this is the API documentations that was there back in the days, pretty basic, but it did its work. And then this is one of the sites that was pretty popular in the learners that were in there, the Rails casts. And it has a huge collection of the videos and whatnot. So yeah, some people who helped me with this talk, Prathamesh, Neeraj, Gautam, Charles, Matt, thank you. And yeah, that's my talk. So thank you. So one last thing is that now that there is a trend going on, which is a 10-year challenge, I have created one more slide for you. So this is Ruby on Rails 10 years challenge. So this was how Rails looked in 2009 versus 2019. Obviously, the websites are also different, and you can see in terms of features, it was 1.9 versus 2.6 of Ruby, and 2.3 versus 6.0 in Rails. Rails 6.0 will be released at the RailsConf this year, and you can also see how many new features are there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Ratnadeep, for the memories. Personally, I started Ruby development with Merb. I miss Merb pretty much every single day of my life. It was a fantastic framework. It also had the coolest tagline. It said, no code runs faster than no code, which is true when you think of it. And I hadn't touched Active Record till about 5 years into my Ruby development career. I was using Data Mapper. Please, somebody revive Data Mapper. I know like there's the ROM RB library now, but Data Mapper was something else. It was just a work of genius and fully leveraging Ruby metaprogramming capability. And you could do things like you could have a symbol and you could put .gt, and everyone said like, this is going to blow up, you're overriding the symbol class, and like it's just going to be disaster everywhere. But you know what? It never did. Like it never did blow up. That's how awesome Ruby community is. You can give so much power in the hands of developers and it still somehow seems to work. So thanks very much, Ratnadeep, for the nostalgia and the memories. We do have time for questions. So if there are any.
Everyone wants to go to lunch.
Yeah.
Sometimes when I raise my hand, he actually thinks I'm trying to interrupt him. But so I have a question for the audience. Which is the, and you all can all answer in unison, and then one voice will probably let it be known. Which is the oldest, because it's the Rails context, which is the oldest Rails version you have used? If the loudest, please. 1 point? 1.1. Okay, anyone? Repeat that. Did you really use it? Did it work? All right. No, 1.1.4. So you just beat me, but. Are you still use it?
Take a mic. The one with 2.1.
Yeah. So I still have an app which is running 2.1.
Oh, that.
My apologies. Yeah, which is the oldest version of Ruby that you all have used? I'm standing next to the person who's not supposed to answer. But he doesn't write in Ruby, right? He writes in C. Oldest version of Ruby. 1.8. I think 1.8 is the one which got 1.87? 1.87. What about you, Sid? 0.1?
I don't even remember now. But there was this thing, Ruby Enterprise Edition. Like, anyone ever use Ruby Enterprise Edition? It was fantastic. And there was this thing called Fusion Passenger, which was the only way you could deploy like a Rails app or a Ruby app in production. It was horrible. Like, you guys, kids these days, you have no idea what it was like back in the day. We had to walk to school uphill both ways. So certainly we have come a very, very long way. I also wanted to say, sorry, I was going to say something about Data Mapper. The first time I used Active Record, my initial reaction was, what is this garbage that people are using and how are they doing it? Anyone share that opinion? Like, it's just terrible. Like, and anything DHH said about programming after that, I would like, no, man. But you made Active Record, like, I mean, sure, it works. Everybody uses it, but how? So it was fantastic. Even SQL was better than Active Record. Anyone use SQL? Great library, like just so nicely put together. Yeah? Cool. Cheers. Anyone else have some nice memories from back in the day? Maybe the time you dropped the production database because you put database URL in your environment and like you ran the tests and you had forgotten that you had put database URL in you remember that? That was me. And I'm like, why are my tests taking so long to start? And then I realized like it was dropping the production server. I'm like, Huh? Life before bundler. Awesome. Thanks, Ratnadeep.
Thank you.